Hello students, how are you? Welcome to my lecture. I am Lokesh Kumar Gupta going to explain the respiration in animals. In previous lecture I had explained you about the respiration and the types of respiration. Right? In this present lecture I am going to explain how animals respire. So if we talk about the animals, so animals are those organisms who evolve different types of organ for this function, for this respiration. So these animals develop these organs for the uptake of oxygen that is available in our environment, and they also get rid the carbon dioxide that present in its body. So these are the specific organ to perform these functions, the uptake of oxygen from the environment and getting rid of the CO2 that is present, that is produced by the cell in its body. So different types of animals develop different type of such organs to perform this respiration, like gills, skin, trachea, lungs. So these are the different types of organs to perform the function of respiration. So if we talk about these organs, so these organs are very specific to animals. For example, the fishes. These animals, the fishes, they live in the water and they need the use of DO. What is DO? DO means the dissolved oxygen, the available oxygen which present in the water. So fishes basically utilize or use this dissolved oxygen and taken up the oxygen that present in the water by the blood. After that, these fishes through the mouth force the water to pass into the gills, right? And when the water which is having the free oxygen passes through the gills, then the oxygen available in the water easily taken up by the blood. After the taken up of the blood, the carbon dioxide produced by the respiration is back by the blood through the gills into the surrounding water. So this gill is a very specific organ. This gills is utilizing the oxygen present in the water in free form, and it also expels the CO2 that is produced by the cell inside the body of the fishes. So that's why this gill is act as a respiratory organ in the aquatic organisms, only in the aquatic organisms. So gills are present in aquatic organisms because in the water medium oxygen is available in dissolved form. But if we move towards the higher organism like terrestrial organisms, for example cockroach, grasshopper, some mosquitoes, so these organisms basically respire through the trachea. So this is the very special organ which present in the terrestrial organism, but specifically in the insects, right? In the insects. So these insects like organism respire through the trachea, and trachea is, it is just tube like structure which is present on the lateral side of the body. So these organisms just are having spiracles like holes, a slit like aperture at the lateral side through which they uptake the oxygen present in the atmosphere, and it also expels the CO2 through the same apparatus. But when we move towards the higher terrestrial organism like the birds, lizard, dog, human beings, these organisms respire through the lungs. So lung is the advanced respiratory organ which present in the higher organism. But if we talk about some terrestrial organisms like earthworm, it respire through the skin. And very special case in the terrestrial organism is the frog. The frog is an example of amphibia, which means it can live in both conditions, in the water body as well as in the earth surface. So frog can respire by both phenomena, by the help of the skin as well as by the help of the lungs. So frog having both mode of respiration. Now, if we move towards the mechanism, towards the activity, what exactly breathing occur in the terrestrial organism. So this breathing occur in two stages. One is the inspiration and another is the expiration. So these are the two steps, two stages in the breathing in the terrestrial organism. Now the question is that what actually means breathing? What is breathing? Let's think. So breathing just a process of exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere. So we all know that oxygen is available in atmosphere, about 21% of oxygen present in our air, right? So this is just an exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere with the carbon dioxide produced by the cell of the living organism. So this exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the atmosphere and the cell of the living organism is known as breathing, right? This breathing basically involves various organs, and these organs constitute a respiratory system in the human beings. So this respiratory system includes nostril and the nasal cavities, pharynx, that is also known as throat, larynx, that is the voice box, trachea, windpipe, and the lungs. So these different organs constitute together and form our respiratory system in the human beings. So this is the diagram of respiratory apparatus, and this diagram is showing the fixed position of the different respiratory organ in the human being, like the nostril. So this is the nostril. Here is the nasal cavity. Now this is the pharynx. Here is the larynx. This is trachea. Bifurcation in the form of the bronchioles. This is the lung. This is also lung. And inside the lungs there are alveoli. And these lungs at the interior end supported by the diaphragm. So this diagram is showing where different respiratory organs are placed in our body. So this is known as respiratory apparatus. Okay, now let's discuss one by one. Nostril. So nostril and nasal cavities. So this is very special structure which present in the human being through which air is taken into the body. So the function of nostril is to just to taking of air from the from the atmosphere to the body. And these nostrils are the opening. Basically these are the openings, paired opening. And these nostrils, these paired openings opens into the two nasal cavities. Now these two nasal cavities are separated by a thin partition, and this partition is known as nasal septum. So nasal septum is the partition that separates two nasal cavities. So nasal cavities like a tubes that carry the air from the surrounding to the body. Now the question is that what is the composition of nasal septum? Means what is the cell which form a nasal septum? So this nasal septum is made up of cartilage, which means it is cartilaginous in nature, right? Now the air that is passing through the nostril is filtered by the fine hair. So let's think about it. In our nasal cavity, there are two different structures are present. One is the fine hair and another is the mucus. The function of the fine hair and the mucus is to make air free from dust. So basically is a first line of filtration of the air, because sometimes air is having some pollutants, some pollen grains, some microparticles. So these particles can be filtered by the hair and also trapped by the mucus present in our nasal cavity. But if the particle size is very, very minute, less than 2.5 micrometer, then these particles can enter in our respiratory apparatus to the lungs part also. So now look at here. So this is the diagram which is showing the nostril nasal cavity. So this is the opening, that is nostril, and this is the nasal cavity. Now, next question is, how do we sense the smell? How we sense smell? The answer is that in our nasal cavity there is olfactory epithelial cell. So this olfactory epithelial cell line our nasal cavity, and this olfactory cell or nasal cavity also having some olfactory neuron, and these olfactory neuron transmit the signal with the brain, and brain provides the information like the sense of smell, whether it is the fruity smell, whether it is the citric smell, and different type of smells. Now finally, these nasal chambers open into the pharynx. Now move to the next organ of the respiratory system, the pharynx. The pharynx is also known as throat, right? So this is the throat. So basically pharynx provide the passage for both air as well as food. So this is the common passage for the air as well as for the food. That's why it is known as crossing center of the food and the air. Now this air passes through the throat into a lungs via larynx. So this pharynx is connected with the larynx, and this is the connection between the next respiratory organ and the pharynx. Now this pharynx is divided into the nasopharynx. This nasopharynx is the first portion, means the upper portion of the pharynx, and it is just connected with the soft pad that present in our mouth, right? Second part of the pharynx is the oropharynx. So this oropharynx is just lie behind the nasopharynx in the oral cavity. Third is the hypopharynx. This hypopharynx is also known as laryngopharynx. So this is the caudal, the terminal part of the pharynx. So in short, pharynx divided into the three parts: naso, oro, and hypo. Hypo is also known as laryngo. So look at this diagram. Now, this is the portion where the soft palate is present. This is the nasopharynx. Now this crossing center is known as oropharynx, and near the larynx, this is the hypopharynx. So this is the three different position of the different part of the pharynx in our respiratory system. Now move to the next part, larynx. This is also known as voice box. So this larynx is a hollow tube-like structure which is connected to the trachea on the one side and pharynx to the another side. So this is a narrow tube which is connecting the pharynx and the trachea. So the air that is passes through the larynx provide the way to the movement of air to the lungs. So this larynx produces a vocal sound. Basically this is known as the sound box, voice box. It produces sound, and it also prevent the passage of the food and other foreign particle into the lower respiratory tract. So basically this is also act as to prevent the entry of some unwanted particle, unwanted material in our respiratory tract. The wall of the larynx is also made up of cartilage. So this is playing very important role. So the portion which is soft in nature is always made up of cartilage, like the ear, the nose, this larynx, they all are made up of cartilage. Now, the pharynx open into a larynx by a slit-like aperture that is known as glottis. So this is the very important point, the where pharynx open into the larynx. And there is one more important structure, that is the epiglottis. So this epiglottis is present at the upper part of the larynx, and it is just a flap-like projection which just prevent the entry of the food into the respiratory tract. So when we consume food, so during the swelling of the food material, this epiglottis closes the glottis and check the food into it. Now in this diagram you can see the structure of larynx. So in this larynx diagram, you can see the epiglottis. So this is the epiglottis. You can also see the posterior end where it connected with the trachea. Now look at this diagram. This diagram is showing the pharynx. Here is the epiglottis. The food is moving in the esophagus. So this epiglottis basically prevent the entry of this food material in the respiratory tract. So this is the respiratory tract. The food is moving in the esophagus with the help of the epiglottis. So it just cover up the glottis. Now move ahead. Trachea. Trachea is also known as windpipe. So this windpipe is connected with the larynx on the one side, tube-like structure, and the other side it connected with the next respiratory part of our respiratory system. So this trachea is having a rings of cartilage, right? Now the question is why this trachea is having the rings of cartilage. The answer of that question is that these rings support the wall and ensure the air passage, which means it does not collapse during the inspiration. So during the inspiration, the amount of air enter in our respiratory tract. So these rings basically act as a spring, function like a spring by which it prevents the collapsing of the air in our respiratory tract. Now, at the lower end, this trachea bifurcate into a primary bronchi, and these primary bronchi enter in the right and the left lung of the human being. So in this diagram you can see that this is the larynx and here is a trachea. This trachea is having a ring. So these are the rings of cartilage. At this point it is bifurcating into the primary bronchi. Now each primary bronchi entering in the lung. So this is the right lung and this is the left lung. So these primary bronchi enter in the right as well as in the left lungs of the human being. Now move to the next respiratory organ, lungs. It is also known as pulmones, right? So in human being, a pair of lung which is present in the thoracic cavity of the human being. So these lungs are located or lie in the thoracic cavity of the human being on the either side of the heart. So this thoracic cavity at the lower side closed by a diaphragm, right? So these lungs is enclosed in two membranes, which means the lungs have two membranes, right? And these two membranes is having a space that is the lira, and lira is filled with the liral fluid, which provide the lubrication, which prevent the friction of the lungs. Now, lungs are partitioned by a mediastinum, and this mediastinum, this partitioned portion, contain a heart. Now, some important points. The right lung is broader than the left lung, and inside the lung, the passage divided into the small tubules. These are the bronchioles. So bronchioles are present inside the lung, and these bronchioles finally terminate into some sac-like structure, balloon-like structures, which are known as alveoli. So alveoli is the terminal point of this respiratory tract, respiratory system. Now the question is, what is the role of alveoli? What is the function of alveoli? The alveoli is playing very important role in our respiration, in our respiratory system. Means it provide a surface, it provide a site where the exchange of gases takes place, exchange of oxygen and CO2 takes place. So this is the terminal portion, which is having extensive network of blood vessels, and these blood vessels just transport the material, means transport the gases like O2 to the heart, and it also expel or release the CO2 present in our blood. So this is the exchange part of the system. Now look at this diagram. So this is a diagram of the lungs. In this diagram you can see this is the right lung, this is the left lung. So here is the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchioles, and inside these lungs there are various bronchi and the alveoli. So this is the balloon-like structure, that is the alveoli. And these alveoli, you can see the blue line, it is showing the deoxygenated blood, and red line is showing the oxygenated blood. So here is the exchange of the CO2 and O2, because deoxygenated blood means it is having the CO2 high concentration, and oxygenated means that the blood is having the O2. So O2 is present the outside, right? So this O2 just diffuse inside the alveoli, and after diffusion this O2 mix with the blood. But the capillaries which is having the CO2 inside the alveoli, this CO2 also diffuse out from the alveoli. So this is membranous structure which act as a site of exchange between the O2 and CO2. So this O2 and CO2 exchange by the action of the diffusion, which means movement from its own higher concentration to low concentration area. Now, I'm just going to explain what exactly the mechanism of the breathing. So breathing basically includes inspiration, the inhaling of air, and expiration, the exhaling of the air. So the air which present in atmosphere, it is having the O2, CO2, all the gases, but O2 percentage is 21%. So this oxygen enters in our body through the inspiration and reaches the alveoli of the lungs. And at the same time, at the inspiration, the fresh air, atmospheric air, as I told you, enter inside the lung, and at the same time the muscles of the diaphragm contract, because when the air enter in our lung, it expand, right? So chest expand. At the expansion of the chest, diaphragm automatically contracts. So this is the system. Okay, when the air enter in our lung, automatically diaphragm contract down by the increase in the space inside the lung. So this is the pathway. So first of all, this is the nostril through which the air enter in our body. Next is nasal cavity. Then air move in the pharynx. Then trachea. Then primary bronchi. Then bronchioles. And finally it reaches at the alveoli. So this alveoli is the site of gas exchange. Next part is expiration, the expelling of the CO2 which produced by the cell. So in this process, the foul air, means alveolar air which is having the CO2, it moves out of the lung, and the volume of the thoracic cavity automatically decreases. When the air release out, when the volume decreases, then at this process at the same time chest contract, and when the chest contract, diaphragm relaxes. So the expansion and the relaxation of the diaphragm is totally depend on the inspiration and expiration. In inspiration, air enter, chest expand, diaphragm contract. But in expiration, air release, chest contract, diaphragm relaxes. So this is the pathway of the expiration. Alveoli, then bronchioles, then primary bronchi, trachea, pharynx, nasal cavity, nostril, and finally it releases outside the cell. Now in this diagram you can see this is inspiration. Air is entering in the human being. When the air enter, this space expand, thoracic cavity expand, and by this activity this diaphragm get contract, because this is present at the lower side of the chest. So when this chest expand, automatically it create a pressure on the diaphragm by which it get contract. But during the expiration, when the air release outside the body, this chest, this thoracic cavity reduces, contracts, and by this contraction, this diaphragm automatically occupy its own area, which means it get relaxes. Now, in the next animation, you can very well understand what exactly it is happening. So, air is entering. Now, chest expand. Thoracic cavity reduces. Now, air is going out. Chest reduce. Diaphragm relaxes. So, this is the way by which the diaphragm and chest work in a simultaneous manner. Now, in the last, I would like to tell you the steps that involved during the respiration. So, there are various steps. Number one, breathing in the inflow and outflow of the air between the atmosphere and alveoli. So, these are some important points that you have to keep in your mind. Okay, first, inflow and outflow of the air between atmosphere and alveoli. Then, second is the diffusion of gases across the membrane of alveoli. Then there is a transport of gases by the blood, because once the oxygen diffuse inside the alveoli, then the capillaries, then the blood vessel carry this oxygen and transport into the heart. After that, diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the tissue. And finally, this is the utilization of oxygen by the cell for the catabolic reaction and release carbon dioxide. So these are the steps. Okay, how this air entering, what exactly happening inside the alveoli, and the exchange of oxygen and CO2, etc., etc. And at last, the important formula, the respiratory quotient. So this respiratory quotient is the ratio of the volume of CO2 produced to the volume of oxygen consumed in a particular respiration over a time. So we can represent RQ, this is a respiratory quotient, the volume of CO2 liberated and volume of O2 consumed over a period of time. So this is all about the respiration in animal, especially the respiratory system in the human being. Thank you.